Well, yeah. So like you were talking about the my body is a Confederate monument. Is that what it's called?
Think it was called, it was a New York
Yeah.
Times
Yeah.
op-ed
Yeah.
during the debates about, the
Okay.
removal of Confederate monuments,
Yeah.
and this debate that is it reckoning with history and
Mm.
accounting for history, or is it, erasing history?
Yeah.
Um, and I remember this black writer, this black mixed race writer, or who has lineage that has
Mm.
mixed race in it, wrote a piece called "My Body is a Confederate Monument," and put um, that conversation that was like a debate, as if it was an intellectual debate, into
Mm.
context of her embodied past, and the
Right.
fact that um, in her lineage were people who sexually assaulted
Hmm.
other people, and that's how
Yeah.
things came about. And so that cannot be ignored, and just kind of glossed over
Mm.
in this debate. And I remember reading it and just being deeply affected by it, because it took a kind of a third way.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Again, I mean, how can you not be affected by like you have Dunbar Ortiz writes about
Oh yes.
you know, in the chapter about like context and
Yeah.
about how Native American history is taught or not. This idea that one of the big images that stood out in that one was like I think she was saying she asks her class to picture like the United States at the time of the Europeans. I'm not saying that, but they picture the whole country rather than even just the 13 original colonies,
Right.
right? Like an unconscious idea of
Right.
like manifest destiny and
Right.
that it was, quote, a land without people when obviously there've been people for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years in the quote
Yes.
unquote new world. But Imani Perry, the a National Book Award winner, right?
Gosh.
She writes
So
that incredibly moving piece. It's basically to her kids.
yeah.
And I was so interested in, she writes that like, yes, I do want to take my family to Africa to see our roots, to see where we're from. But in some ways, she's like Mississippi in the South, like that's our home. That's where, our story kind of starts
Yes.
in so many ways, right? And then just like that fear of raising these kids who are seen so differently, who we just, she's like, I just want you to be able to be, to breathe, to enjoy. And in that way you're honoring, you know, those who have come before. And again, context is everything. Like
Yeah.
how do you argue against something like Black Lives Matter when you read that? And obviously hers is not a singular story. It's not like she's the exception, she's the rule, right?
I think it's just, so for some people, I mean, we see it's interesting. Things are very bad right now with these, book bans and attempted book bans,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of laws that are being passed. But, I try to take a really, I mean, it's deeply troubling. It feels like so many steps backwards, but I
Right.
think we've never gone through the middle of the fire. We've never,
Huh.
had a true reconciliation. So it has allowed us to learn one-sided history and to have an impression of, Martin Luther King died, but he fixed things for us, and but as opposed to he was murdered, and like we've learned things in a very sanitized or erased way. Our understanding of Native American people and indigenous people is so lacking, in
Mm.
terms of the way, the, stories are told. And we kind of see this, in, throughout. And so when you go to rectify those things, that is deeply destabilizing to the powers that be, to the
Mm.
people who stand to lose some of that power. And that, what was it in the part about the cultural appropriation, cultural sensitivity, it was really interesting to me that as I was, I kind of knew like that chapter is a little different than the others, in the
Yeah.
sense that instead of showing people, oh, this is how you do this, I wanted to share multiple perspectives from
Mm-hmm.
writers who are really thinking about the issue of cultural appropriation and cultural sensitivity in really meaningful ways,
Mm.
but in terms of the word that came up in everybody's pieces was power.
Yes.
or power. And I suddenly realized, as I was highlighting every line, as I do in everything I read, I suddenly was circling it and I was like, oh wait, didn't she talk about it? Oh, didn't he talk, and so power is, it's one of those things that we don't examine sometimes, because sometimes we are the people who have the power. So
Yeah.
it's not something we're going to examine, necessarily, unless we are, compelled to. And I think that's where writing and reading and literature is so important, because we have a perception of our world, and that's why I push back on against the idea of neutrality and objectivity. Is this idea that you have a perspective on the world. And I remember, Junot Diaz at a racial justice conference that I was working at, when I was working in that realm, he came and he spoke and he said, we all have, I'm, paraphrasing, we all have blind spots the shape of ourselves. And that has been something that I've tried to carry with me everywhere, to think about consciously, how have I been acted upon? How have I been acted upon, by my culture, by my parents, by my, and if we sit and we think about it explicitly, and you think about, if you come across something and you come across a piece of history that you never learned, not only is it important to read about that history, but it's actually important to take a moment and say, why was this history not taught to me? Why was it so important for this to be left out of the history books?
Yeah.
And not assume that it's an entirely passive decision. And I included the piece that I wrote called The Red Ink of Revisionist History. And I know one of the realms I don't know a lot about is the education realm. So I actually spent weeks just researching. Like, I didn't understand, to me, the idea that textbooks are anything but an educational tool and seen as a business opportunity. And so, a lot of what we're seeing today is literally trying to look at children's education, not as education, but as an opportunity to, indoctrinate, or to win the culture wars, or to sell books to them. It was amazing. But I wrote that piece because I wanted to understand how I had read about multiple incidents of things being written in history books, like, and we were talking about well-known publishers, educational publishers, writing things saying, slavery was economic migration, or like things like that, really.
Words matter.
And you think, but I always think this wasn't a singular person, like oftentimes we talk about a writer who misspoke or miswrote, or who, but there's so many levels of review for those things. So there was a complicitness, complicity happening, where multiple levels of review. And then I didn't know much about textbook approval process and school boards, and we're all learning about school boards now, as we learn about how, they're being taken over by nefarious entities, folks with an agenda, and so forth, just like we're learning about election boards.
Right.
And these are all cituses of power,
Definitely.
the local level.
I wish that quote wasn't so profound, the one from Junot Diaz. It sounds like he's kind of talking about himself.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, it's interesting, like in the book, I included, quotes, and I thought about this, this is a book that's about, writing with conscience. And I know that there are things that Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has said, in reference to the transgender community. I know there are things that, Junot Diaz, has been alleged to do, and, and all of that. And I thought, should I not include them? And then I thought, no, I think that, like when we have those conversations about artists, whether a visual artist, literary artist, my feeling is canceling is another way, except maybe in the most extreme cases, like truly, but otherwise, I actually think that people should be presented in a holistic way, with their positives and negatives, and with their transgressions, and with their, and then the reader, we trust the reader, the person, to make the decision, and to take it all in and decide, how do they want to, how much, how do they want to think about this? Because, I think in the literary world, we know that there are beautiful, powerful works written and created by people who are deeply flawed, who were in their own ways, and sometimes as a product of their place and time, and so forth. And so this is another thing that I had to sit with, because sometimes, and things that have unfolded, particularly with Junot Diaz, that's a contemporary issue. It's something that happened after I became a writer, and so it's not something that's in the past, and I have to think about it. And one of the things I will say that I've done, and some people won't agree, is, given that I came from the social change space, that work is about transformation. So that means that I have to believe in the power of change, societal change, but societal change starts with individuals, one by one, deciding. So even though sometimes it might be very comfortable for me to be like, yes, I banish you for thinking this or saying this or whatever, I might have to take a pause on a person for my own personal, but then I think I like to believe in the power of, transformation, and change. And I mean, it's on that person to do that. And that's, and this is something this is another thing I had to kind of sit with and say, well, didn't you work in social change? Doesn't that mean this? Don't you think that, you have to kind of allow people? And that's what I worry most about with the way conversations are these days. It doesn't allow for that.
Well, especially like chapter 5 and on, but all throughout the book, there's so much nuance in the book, which is obviously which I very much mean as a compliment. And there's a lot about there's a lot about the why, but there's also the how. Personal narrative like La Otra from Diaz, right? It's a stunning piece. It's very personal. It's about like the relationship between her mother and father and the fights, and then it's like, in the other essay, it's like the which is about like brown and black girls and how like the school to prison pipeline, and it's very statistic based, but it also brings in her wrongful, I don't know that she was imprisoned, but she was accused and tough. Did she have to go juvenile hall maybe?
I think so, yeah.
Right. But just you write about how the personal narrative can be so well connected and show to more objective stat-based things, data-based, and then of course the hybrid is you think of like the ethos and pathos and logos and that type of thing, right?
And I don't know from where you're sitting, I definitely, over the course of teaching the course, the hybrid thing is something that came up and just kind of grew as I saw more and more books and pieces that that were pursuing a hybrid model.
I agree
and
with
I feel like, do you see that more from where you sit? I definitely see it more. And what I found is, as I kind of started including it in the class and kind of referencing it more and talking about it more and giving examples, and it really resonates with a lot of people in my classes, because maybe they are academics, but they also have experienced the issue, and it was partly their experience of the issue personally that pushed them to pursue studying it deeply and now writing about it, and the feeling that writing about it academically does not completely fulfill what they're trying to accomplish. Writing about it in a personal essay maybe doesn't make them feel like they are able to give the depth of history and context that they want to. And so I think what's exciting is I think we are seeing the form ahead of the kind of leading the way for literature, meaning before we have all the language to talk about hybridity and how it works and how it, we are seeing it kind of off and running. And sometimes it's, the poets who are leading this, because, they are, they're often ahead of the curve on everything.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, so like the like Jose Antonio Vargas, who I'm crossing my fingers I've talked to, maybe going to be a guest down the road, but
great.
The advocate for immigration reform. And what makes his writing so moving and so award-winning is that he's an expert on the numbers and the stats, and this year this many people and this and that, but also personally affected, right? And
Yes.
his big quote coming out as an undocumented immigrant was very
Exactly.
courageous, and kind of the shot heard around the world. And
Mhm.
is it pronounced the woman who identifies as Dalit, is it Dut or Doot, her last
What
name?
are you talking about? Oh, Yashika Dutt. Yes.
Right, but she talked about quote unquote also
Yes.
coming out as
Coming out
Dalit,
as Dalit. Exactly.
right? And just as Dalit, like, and saying that, hey, this is not an Indian problem, this is a global one. I mean, that was
It's a global
so,
problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was so affecting that it takes place an hour and a half away from me, or 2 hours away from me, in Silicon Valley, where I went to college. And that a lot of us wouldn't even know that the caste system still has those remnants, and how it affects Americans and stuff,
In
life in
this
America.
country,
Right.
in life in this country. And I
Right.
can definitely say it's definitely I see its pervasiveness. But it's like, just that, that's a really good point you make. Like, both of them, they had this coming out
Uh-huh.
experience. And that, if you think about it, the fact that it has to be later in someone's life, or it's something that they're
Yes.
something they're thinking of the pros and cons, or what could be lost, and all of that, that does all that it deeply underscores
Speaks
what is
volumes,
at
yeah.
risk and the stigma.
Mm-hmm.
So when people sit there, and so that perspective is so valuable, because they're telling the story from the inside. And that's one of the things I talk about, is this idea of, do you want to report this thing from the outside? Do you want to tell the story from the inside out?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, of course, models of hybridity, which allow you to kind of, I think what hybridity allows is this kind of toggling back and forth between,
Yes.
insider and outsider perspective,
Mm-hmm.
which allows you, the left brain, right brain, depending on
Mm-hmm.
different people. For some people, reading dispassionate reportage with statistics is actually what works, is what something that
Yeah.
persuades them even more, because they're like, well, listen, I'm a numbers guy, and
Mm-hmm.
this is what I'm paying attention to, and it's really this that opened my eyes up to the harms of climate change, because look at how much land mass is being lost, like, so they'll,
Mm-hmm.
that's that. There are those people, and then there are others who it's the personal story of losing livelihoods, people, farmers losing their livelihoods, that because they themselves are a farmer, and suddenly they're like, oh my gosh, this is what's
Mm-hmm.
happening. And then there's like a lot of people in between who, when confronted with both, suddenly they are not able to uh, continue to not think about that issue, because they're kind of seeing it from a macro and micro perspective, and that combination is really powerful.
Yeah, again, nuance and subtleties are definitely common themes throughout the book.
Yeah.
Nicole Chung, like, her piece was so good because it's about her being being a transracial adoptee, and people trying to like impose their ideas on her story, even on her parents, her adopted parents. And she can, both things can be true at once. She can say, I love my adopted family, and I've had very good experiences, but also I have these ambivalent feelings, and racism has been an issue for sure, and I've been made to feel different, I've been made to feel hated. And like, the both of those can be true at the same time, right?
But it's interesting to me when you think about, like, I love, I read her book also, that this grew out of. And it's interesting to me when you think about the resistance to this, so essentially she's complicating the tropes or the
Right.
narratives that have existed, right? Like,
Mhm.
thank goodness some good white people came and rescued
Yes,
you,
yes, yes, yes.
and now your life is so much better. And
Christian white people.
yeah, Christian white people,
Mhm.
absolutely. And so like that's and there's nothing more to see here, it's like, this is
Mm,
the beginning and the middle and the end of the story. and
yeah.
and if you read about, in that piece that's included in here and in her book and in other things that she's written, the reaction to her saying this, some people get so, it triggers such anger,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
such, oh, you're ungrateful, and
Mm.
and you think about why is there that reaction?
Yeah, who are
This,
they to tell her?
yeah, no, why is that? Why are they so invested in this? And because they're invested in that narrative. And it's kind of like, Jenga, when you pull out one piece, then it requires them to, it's, when you look at, whether it's like you talk about the Catholic Church, and how much was invested in, the secrecy, around priests and assaults, of children. You think about whether it's in Boston or whether it's in other places.
Unfortunately, all over.
Yeah, all over. And that's the thing. It was actually all over. And so you think about, and that's why I've come to, really think about, I used to, as I stepped back, and that's hard to do sometimes when you feel very passionately, and then you have to kind of step back and say, this is not, a onesie twosie. This is not just a singular incident. There are people who are very invested in this. And some of those people, it's about power, and some of those people, it's an unraveling. If this isn't true, what else isn't true? It's a lot to take, when you sit down with that. But if you willingly sit down and say, wow, I was somebody who learned a lot of history in school. How was this very important history left out? And why? And it's not about being a conspiracy theorist, it's really about understanding the way power works and how history sometimes become crafted, and created and packaged because it's very important to the present time and how things exist in the present time.
Well, yeah. So this chronologically, this is not the last piece, but a good one to end on, where you talk about like, once the Jenga thing, once you take out one piece, other pieces fall, so to speak. Like, somebody named Kavita Das, I don't know if you know her.
I vaguely heard about her,
but
right.
Yeah. But that piece on tolerance, I thought was so interesting. Like, that has been the American model, I don't know, since the like tolerance.
Yeah.
And we tolerate all. And maybe the people who kind of were pushing that kind of had good intentions, like tolerance for all, melting pot and all of that. But tolerance, I mean, there's so much in that word. Tolerance, like you said, is just barely tolerating somebody, barely, not even thinking of people's, like, what is it, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's just like maybe the life, liberty, right? And I mean, it's very, very, very limiting, and it's also, it makes the person look like an imposition, right?
Exactly. And
I'm doing you a favor.
And my understanding of the word evolved because I grew up in late 70s, early 80s, and tolerance was this beautiful thing, and, it's how we're all going to get along and be together. And then I realized, no, what they're really talking about is these people tolerating these people, which suggests that fundamentally who belongs and who doesn't belong, and who's, as you said, doing a favor by letting them sleep in the basement, and that's tolerating, as a, so, and then I had to sit with the word and really say, how do I use the word in a daily, on a daily basis? Is that a word that I use to say that I really like something or that I enjoy something? Or, you talk about like literally tolerating, what spice level can you tolerate? I think I use that example in the piece. And I think, that's often a time, I think that's the actual word that's used when they talk about
pain comes into involved.
Pain threshold.
Pain tolerance,
So I really sat with that and I'd examine it. And because I was, I think this was in the wake of the George Floyd murder, and I was looking at the conversations, and I was like, what's kind of missing from this conversation, and talking, and I was hearing the word tolerance kind of thrown around. I said, that's such a low bar, and I think, it's like the way I feel about, we hear now about more and more, whether it's in publishing, whether it's in different realms, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's like diversity is usually where things stop. It's like what you see in commercials. Now commercials are more diverse, but, and that's not nothing,
it's a start.
So it's a start. It's just that oftentimes it's the end right now. It's like, what more do you want? Don't you see you're in the commercials? It's like, and not really thinking about equity and what equity looks like, and why is that? Oh, I mean, why do we stop there? Why do we, power. It goes back to power.
Yeah.
And like, and the fact that, you realize that, oh, we have to actually go to the root of this thing, and we actually have to, start and think about why this is. And, I've thought a lot over the last few years, what an examination would look like of all the companies, all the entities that made statements in the weeks following the murder of George Floyd. And if, like literally, if, just a whole group of people showed up, and said, hey, we'd like to go through and see what actually has been done, to make those statements that were made, and proclamations and
evidence,
promises, what has actually been done. And I think, and I know people who do diversity, equity, inclusion work, and how they sometimes feel so pulled, because can a singular person or two people come in and, is it their job to undo what an organization or a company has put into place for decades? Can a singular person, or can a person put into a position within the organization who might not have, the lines of power, so it's very, very complicated. And that's why, I think when someone's writing about, these things, they have to kind of sit with and say, okay, who am I in this? What is my motivations? Who do I really need to talk to in here beyond the HR spokesperson? Well, who do you really need to talk to? And I was really excited. I've had students literally say, they're going to do co-bylines with their subject, so we talk about shifting the needle and, changing the balance of power. And, as a result of taking, my class, or, Crystal Z. Campbell, whose piece is in here, who's both a visual artist and a writer and a poet, it's such a powerful piece about a personal connection to the Tulsa race massacre, being from Tulsa and not learning that history, and being, a Black multiracial person, and what is why is that history not taught in Tulsa? And also, it used to be referred to as the Tulsa race riot, and why was that language used as opposed to like, so you really, when you get underneath you, and and in their piece, they really talk about going into the archives and how much has been literally erased or blacked out on record.
Holes in it or something, right?
Yes, exactly. And so it's really fascinating. And you just think, oh, wow, this didn't have like, there is a very intentional effort, to alter and to shape, history. And that's why I thought Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's piece, it's like, okay, if we're gonna, like, let's she's recontextualizing history by talking about the history from a different perspective, which just literally changes both the context and the narrative, because by changing the context and who's telling it, the narrative itself is going to shift. So, and and that's like, usually that's a big aha moment for my students, is thinking about context and narrative and thinking about them. And I know maybe it's not entirely oppositional, but it helped me in making decisions, because every time you sit down to write, you have to make decisions about what are you going to focus on. What if it's when you try to do everything and serve everybody, that usually a piece fails. And that was a hard thing for me to learn, because I was trying to do everything, satisfy my background in social studies and satisfy, narrative. And it doesn't always work that way. So I had to really think, for this piece, for this moment, what, how much background and information do I want to give? And how much do I want to focus on the narrative elements? And how is it going to show up in this piece? And usually, when we talk about that, and I kind of talk about it in those terms, people have an epiphany, and it liberates them perhaps to kind of, I think what it does is helps you find your voice for a piece, rather than being governed by other things.
Well, yeah, those opinions and those epiphanies, I should say, those come with questions and questions and discussion. And you mentioned being in the book being published in Longreads, and there's nothing like the drawn, the long discussions instead of our bite size,
Oh,
Twitter,
yes.
like I
Yeah.
said, hot takes and just the questions. There's so many questions that come up through the book, and the great thinkers and writers and books are full of questions and questions and questions, and that's one of the great things about your book.
Oh, thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the deep read and this great conversation. You were talking about long reads and this conversation is like one of
Right.
those conversations where we've gotten under the hood of the car and just kind of messed around. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm looking forward to like using, parts of it, all of it in my classes, Definitely if I were teaching at the college level, but I know there's stuff for the high school level that, in smaller pieces or articles or connect, they can definitely be used. It's such a cool self-perpetuating or self-propelling thing where I could see it being used. You brought it about because of your teaching in classes, and I can see other
Yeah.
classes using it for sure. So it definitely
That's
is
one
a
of the most
how-to.
edifying. Yeah, that's one of the most edifying things is that I hear about it out in the world,
Hmm.
even zooming into classrooms,
Oh,
I've zoomed into
cool.
classrooms and the questions that students, have asked. I mean, a father who is doctor, and actually, the father was in one race, the son was mixed race. They came to an event of mine, and that son was in high school, and the son asked like a really excellent, question. And I was so happy. The father bought him the book and then, asked me to sign it to the son. And
Hmm.
I thought, and said, oh, he wants to write and he's thinking about all these issues. And I think this will really, spur him. So I will say that I really tried to write it with the least amount of jargon.
Hmm.
And every time, if I did, I would kind of go back in the second pass or third pass and say, is there another way I can say this? Because,
Hmm.
I remember somebody in my class asking me at one point, what is craft? And that really shows you that even that is a word that is not, universal or universally
Sure.
understood.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. The book does feel very accessible for sure. I know that's always something that is, could be subjective, but definitely accessible one and one that's going to have a long, pardon the pun, shelf life.
I hope so.
But I'm bummed.
Hope so. Thank you.
Thanks so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Pete. Thank you so much for this
Thank
great
you.
discussion.